Okay, so our last video, we left off looking at the anatomy of muscle, and we basically said that muscle cells resemble spaghetti noodles, and we bundle those spaghetti noodles up into these bundles called fascicles. We bundle the fascicles into muscles. And then we said that within each spaghetti noodle are these even smaller cylinders called myofibrils, which are made up of proteins. So now we're going to look at just muscle function a little bit more and how they work. And I've broken this down into 4 concepts. And I use clay to teach this, but of course in Screencast land, we're not going to do that way. We're going to do some video clips of some clay. So I'll intersperse as we go. So muscle concept 1, muscles have at least 2 attachments and cross at least 1 joint. And exceptions exist to this. So an example would be the bicep muscle. The bicep, this is a cool tattoo, by the way. The bicep muscle is attached up here to the top of the humerus, and then to, I believe it's the clavicle there. And it also attaches down here to the radius. So you'll see that it has at least 2 attachments. It attaches here, and then down here as well. So 3 in this case. That's by the way why it's called the biceps, because it has 2 attachments up here, plus this one. The triceps has 3 attachments up here. And 1 down there. Anyway, I keep digressing. So it has at least 2 attachments and it crosses at least 1 joint, in this case, the elbow. It's crossing. Exceptions to this do exist. The diaphragm, for example, we've talked a bit about, is this muscle beneath your rib cage. We'll look more at that later, but that doesn't really follow the rules. So there's exceptions to this. But in general, they have at least 2 attachments, cross at least 1 joint. Can we build it? Well, no, Bob, we can't, because we don't have clay at home. So instead, I'm going to show a little video clip here that will kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So we'll hit play on that one.
All right, so we are going to model concept number 1, which is that muscles have at least 2 attachments and cross at least 1 joint. And so what I've made here is a muscle called the brachialis. And you don't hear much about that, and if you look at pictures and diagrams of the muscular system, you don't get to see much of the brachialis, and that's because it sits right on the skeleton, and so it's kind of hidden by the biceps, for example, and other muscles that kind of cover it up. So that's why I like these mannequins, because you get to build from the ground up. So the brachialis, it actually attaches in 2 places. It attaches at the ulna here, and then about midway up the humerus. And so you can kind of see, and I'm just going to cover up the nerves, that first concept, this muscle has at least 2 attachments and crosses at least 1 joint, in this case, the elbow.
So muscle concept 2 is that muscles always pull and get shorter. And so can we act that out? Kind of. You can do this at home. You can play along with the video. So let me play the video and kind of show what I mean about how muscles always pull and get shorter.
So muscle concept 2 is that muscles only pull and get shorter. And so to take us back to our brachialis muscle that we built, it has 2 attachments, the humerus and the ulna. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my fingers here, and you'll notice the distance between my fingers. So when my arm bends, then the muscle shortens. And you can see that represented as the distance between my 2 fingers shortens. So since my 2 attachments are on either end of the joint, when the muscle shortens, it actually pulls the bones closer, and that is what makes my arm bend.
Concept 3, there are terms used to describe the attachments. So we have at least 2 attachments. One of those is going to be the origin, and the other is the insertion. The origin is the attachment that stays put, and the insertion is the attachment that moves. What does that mean? Well, an example would be a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid. So the origin in this case is the sternum and the clavicle, hence the name sternocleido, sternum and clavicle. So sternocleidomastoid, and the insertion is the mastoid process of the skull, that bump in the back of the skull that you learned about. So you can see the sternocleidomastoid. It's in the neck. Sometimes when like a really buff man is angry. You can see this neck thing bulging out. That's the sternocleidomastoid. You can see it attaches down here on the sternum. It attaches here on the clavicle, and then attaches to the mastoid process. So when this thing gets shorter, it ends up pulling the mastoid process down, and that actually helps turn your head. So the mastoid process, your skull, when you kind of turn your head like this, if you look at my little screen in the corner, this attachment is moving. So we call that the insertion. These two stay put. In other words, the mastoid process of the skull is pulled down towards the sternum and the clavicle. Your sternum and clavicle are not yanked upward towards your head when this muscle moves. So here's another shot of that muscle, sternocleidomastoid. And then here's a video clip. Oh, wait, first, can we figure out which attachment is the origin and which attachment is the insertion? Yes, we can, Bob. Here's a video clip that's going to help us do that.
Okay, so concept 3, there are names for these two attachments, the origin and the insertion. The origin is the attachment that stays put, and the insertion is the attachment that moves. So how do we figure out which is which? Well, if you take a look at my fingers, we have these two attachments, the ulna and the humerus, and if I bend, you'll notice one of my fingers is going to move and one is going to stay put. So I'm going to bend, and can you guys tell, Bryson or Addie, which of my fingers is moving or which one is staying put?
Pointer's moving.
Your left one's moving.
This one's moving and this is staying put. So in this case, the origin would be the humerus and the insertion would be the ulna, because the origin stays put, just like my humerus is staying put, and the insertion moves, just like my ulna is moving.
And finally, muscle concept 4. Muscle fibers point to their attachments, and this actually tells you how a muscle moves. So can we add lines for fibers? Yes, we can. So again, here's that video clip that kind of illustrates what I mean by those lines and how they point to their attachments.
Okay, so concept 4 is that the muscle fibers indicate the direction that the muscle shortens. And so I'm going to draw in these little lines. And you notice your coloring packet and pictures of muscles, they always have these little lines on there. And those represent, think back to our spaghetti noodle model, they represent those little boundaries between the muscle fibers. And the thing is, those muscle fibers are the spaghetti noodles are getting shorter. And so these lines kind of indicate the direction in which it gets shorter. And so as this muscle shortens, the spaghetti noodles shorten in this direction. And so these lines indicate the direction that a muscle shortens.
So to practice that last concept, if you look at, here's just some pictures of some mannequin models, and there's 3 parts to the pectoralis muscle. The first part is the pectoralis major. You can see its origin is here in the sternum, and the insertion is the arm. And so if you imagine this muscle shortening along these lines, I don't know if you can see in the little window of the computer there, but if you can imagine that muscle, it attaches to my sternum and attaches to my arm here. When that shortens, that's going to pull my arm in like that. And so if you just imagine these lines here shortening, that's going to pull the arm in. And so you can kind of use these lines to figure out what kind of movement is going to be made. So that one we kind of did together is like a tennis swing. The next one is down here. So the origin is down at the base of the sternum. The insertion is up in the shoulder. So you can imagine if you stick your arm in the air and then you imagine one attachment way down here on your chest and the other one here, and then if that shortens, that's going to pull your arm down. Can you kind of see that? If those lines shorten along the length of their lines, that's going to be like a volleyball spike. And then finally, this one, the origin is the clavicle and the insertion is here. So if you imagine that muscle shortening along these lines, that's gonna sort of pull this thing up. So that would be like an uppercut punch or a bowling swing, or if you're aggressively giving someone the finger, that would be that particular muscle. So you can use these as a little clue to figure out how a muscle actually moves, and that's quite a little handy shortcut instead of trying to memorize every single thing. So at this point, you are ready for homework 5A. That will not be an assignment just yet. That'll be for a different day, probably tomorrow or the next day. I don't know what it is, but eventually there will be a specific time when that will be your task for the day. But if you want to jump ahead, you're ready to roll with it. So homework 5A, you're ready to go. Thanks, everybody.